Hello, everyone. My name is Keri Ramirez. I am the Managing Director of Studymove, and it's great to welcome you to this, our third key data update of this year. Today, we thought it would be interesting just to talk about an area that is getting a lot of interest across all Australian universities. Today, we're going to talk about articulation agreements, which we know that it has always been an important part of what we do in terms of international education. And this is not only in Australia, in many other countries, universities, they spend a lot of time bringing successful partnerships across the globe. But recently in Australia, this is taking more interest, and I believe this is clearly the result of the change in the policy framework that is creating more interest for education providers to see how they can build successful recruitment pathways and also institutional partnerships, not only with education providers or institutions in Australia, but also all around the globe. And today, we're going to share with you some of the interesting data that we have been collecting in this particular area. So I hope you find this session interesting. Now, really, this is all about how the data that the Studymove has collected in this particular area could support or is supporting what Australian universities are doing in engaging with partners in order to create articulation agreements. And as I said before, we know that this is not new. Universities have been doing this for many, many years. Some universities more active than others. But what we know is that definitely this is an area that is growing interest. And just to put it in context, recently it was released a report from NUAS, Navitas, and the Pi News that basically is a global survey of leaders from around the world who are implementing international education strategies. And in that report, it shows clearly how the role of articulation agreements is growing. Question 11 of this survey basically says, broadly speaking, what proportion of international students will be recruited through the following channels? And as you can see on the screen, there are the traditional channels like education agents or the engagement with schools. Articulation is the third one. And in Australia and also in New Zealand is expected, this is the results from this survey, that 1 in 10 international students will be recruited through an articulation agreement, which shows that it plays an important role on the things that we do. And for that reason, we thought it would be very useful just to provide some of the insights on the data that we have collected. Now, in regards to the data that we have collected, we have been doing this since 2019. So we have been doing this for quite a little bit of time. We collect data related to articulation agreements across all Australian universities. We do it every 2 years because it's an area that doesn't change that often. And as I said, the first time that we did this, it was in 2019. It's one of the largest set of data that we have with us. And the rationality behind this, it actually comes from universities asking us for something that could help them to engage more effectively in this particular area. And this is because it seems that the seeding stage of an articulation agreement most likely comes from an organic story. It could be that probably two members of a faculty from your university, they meet with faculty from another university across the world. They meet in a conference, they start talking to each other. They see that there are some similarities in the academic profile of each institution and basically the programs that probably both universities or institutions have. And from there, they start growing this idea of building an articulation agreement. And what universities are asking us is look into how data could really make this, that seems to be quite organic, something a little bit more strategic and probably more efficient. Basically, what universities have been asking us is how you can actually provide us with data that helps us to really find the right strategic partner that is not only based on these conversations that happens across academics or faculties, which they are very valuable because without them, it wouldn't be that the spark of ideas of what it could be the start of an articulation agreement, but how those conversations could be supported by data to identify if that particular conversation is actually what the university it really requires or not. Um, on top of that, universities keep telling us the feedback that part of the process of, once again, setting the articulation agreement could actually take a lot of time. Sometimes it's not very efficient because compared, although, on a first assessment, you can say, oh, this university around the world or across the world has some similarities. When you start matching programs by programs, sometimes it's a process that takes a lot of time and sometimes it's not very effective. So once again, universities ask us how the data that is available could really help us just to accelerate and make this process more effective. So one, to identify the best partners, but also after you identify a potential partner, how you can actually make the process of engaging in articulation or a potential articulation agreement more effective. And finally, and a lot of you will be aware of this, sometimes there is the right partner, the great idea, but when you put that proposal across many different parts of the university, this is when it gets more difficult because everybody has a different view. Probably something that aligns academically probably doesn't align with the institutional goals of your university. So once again, how the data could really help to move this process and communicate this process and the intentions of this process of building articulation agreements more effectively across stakeholders. And this is not only stakeholders at your university, it could also be when you are talking to the potential partner university, how the data could really help you. And this is when the data set that I'm going to share with you comes along. Is really just to move or support this process that, as I said, in many times is organic. How can we actually make it more strategic and more efficient with the use of data? So what we have done since 2019 is basically collect the data that is available in the area of articulation and recognition of prior learning. As I said, this is probably one of the largest data sets that we have. It contains a lot of information. In fact, last time that we put together this report, it contained information of 35 Australian universities engaging in this particular area. And as a result of that, we managed to collect 18,000 or information from 18,000 different articulation agreements and recognition of prior learning agreements as well. And the idea behind this is that when you actually have the bigger picture of what others are doing in a particular area, that really will help you just to have a better understanding of who could be your potential partner to build an articulation agreement, but also in which areas. It could be probably in certain discipline areas, but not in others. But also, if there is a history already in articulation agreements that probably other universities in Australia have done, you could actually look into that data and basically make more efficient the process of building an articulation agreement based on the story that the data set is telling you. So for us, something that is great out of this data set is, yes, see the big picture, but drilling down and see in that particular area or with that particular partner that you want to build an articulation agreement, there is any history or any potential or anything else to help you just to move forward in the process. And today, it's all about that, building into how we can actually use this data and how we can have a better understanding of what Australian universities are doing in this area in particular. So we're going to use the latest data that we collect to provide you some main findings. This is one of those areas where I think everybody has a particular interest in a particular market or in a particular partner. But it's very useful just to have an idea of what, in general, all Australian universities are doing. So I'm just going to share with you a little bit of the methodology that we put together for the analysis, and then take you through some of these main highlights of the latest articulation and recognition previous learning agreements that StudyMove has developed recently for all of you. And of course, we'll have time for a Q&A. If you prefer to send us an email asking for more information or to see a demo or a sample of the data that it has been collected, we're more than happy to do that. It has been one of those analyses that it takes a lot of time to put together because the data is not consistent. But we are getting a lot of positive feedback year by year on universities who are really using this just to be and to get a more strategic approach in the use of articulation agreements. Okay. So let me just explain the methodology. So as I said, all the data is collected from information that is in the public domain. A lot of Australian universities have that information available on their websites, or also through calculators like Articulation or credit for previous study calculator, that we basically get all that information and we can actually start getting more sense of what's happening there. So that data set was collected in mid-2024. As I said, it's not one of those areas that things change quite rapidly. And the information that we collect is anything that is a formal articulation agreement that an Australian university has with either a local or an international partner. Also, just to complement this, because there is a lot of information in this area, we collect data on credit from previous studies awarded for studies undertaken at local or international institutions, or credit transfer agreements that exist as well across each university with their partners. This brings a very, very comprehensive data set of data that most of the time is related to articulation. Sometimes are the RPL agreements, recognition of previous learnings, which it gives us a better understanding of where universities are actually doing some work in basically this area, and give us a good sense of how, when you are matching curriculums or getting a credit for one or other programs, universities are actually applying the rules or their views about this. Okay. So it is a very large data set. So probably not only the work of collecting all data is huge, but also to clean it and to classify it. And that's when we see a lot of value into all this. For us, it's very important just to understand if that articulation agreement, for example, corresponds to a particular broad field of study or a particular discipline area, or what are the kind of arrangements that universities are taking in place, also in which countries or which institutions located in which countries are more actively doing things. So we spend a lot of time just to clean and classify the data, and that allows us just to give us some of the main findings today. Now, something that I think is important also just to explain is that, as I said, every university presents this kind of data in different ways. As from the 40 Australian universities, 5, we couldn't get anything. But from the other 35, it actually comes in very different kind of like levels of completeness. Some universities only provides the partner's name. They basically said, we have articulation or recognition of pre-learning agreements with, and they give you the list of all the universities or institutions around the world that actually they work with. Some others provide richer amount of data, and they basically give us the list of all the partners that they have and the name of the articulation agreement or the program that they actually provide in the articulation or the recognition of pre-learning. So for example, they said, we work with University of Tokyo and we recognize these particular programs, or we actually work with this Polytechnic in Singapore, and this, if the student goes to a diploma in business, that's what the agreement is all about. Finally, we have the most comprehensive data sets that is quite a few of universities who they give you, or we were able to collect the partner's name, the program name, and also the amount of credit that they actually offering. So the complete lot, which is extremely valuable, so everybody can understand and can actually make better decisions in this particular area. Okay? Now, I should acknowledge that this is based on information that is on the public domain. Sometimes this information is not up to date. Sometimes the information, as I said, is not complete. So we acknowledge that there are some data limitations. But what we are trying just to build is from nothing that exists, or really nothing that you can actually take from a data perspective to support this area, give you something that will provide some perspective and some indication of what others are doing, so you can actually get direction, and as I said, had a much more effective way in which you can actually grow your articulation agreements, and you can actually talk to stakeholders across universities or with partners about what you would like, what's your objective in terms of building an articulation agreement. Okay? So that's in general the data that we has been collected, and from there, let me tell you what are kind of like the main findings that we identify from the last data set. Now, once again, I truly believe that a lot of the value in all this is when you actually drill down and you can actually say, okay, I want to start an articulation agreement with, let's say, this polytechnic in Singapore. Who else has done it? In which programs they got articulation, and from there you can actually, that specific story, you can actually enrich it with the use of data. But as I said, it's also very interesting also to understand the big picture, and today it's all about the big picture as well. So today I'm going to talk about a large number of agreements that we collect, and how those agreements have been located geographically. So basically with who Australian universities are engaging, in which areas of studies, and also very interesting in by which study level. But before I do that, let me just explain you a little bit of how we actually make the count of the agreements. And this is important because the data is not uniform. So we actually had to put some parameters on how we actually count each agreement for the analysis. So in order to make a count, we consider an Australian university that is making an articulation agreement or an RPL agreement with an institution that could be around the world or could be in Australia. And from there, we identify which programs gets articulated. So as I said, let's just say there's Australian university that engaged with a polytechnic in Singapore, and the program that gets in the articulation agreement is a diploma of business. So that particular arrangement, we counted it as one agreement, okay? So when you see through the presentation that I talk about 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 50% agreements, that's the count that we are taking. Now, we also take in consideration that in some instances, the same university probably engaged with the same partner institution, but not only one program gets the articulation agreement or the RPL agreement, it could be several of them. So from an institutional perspective, you will say, oh, well, that's only one agreement. But for the purpose of this analysis, we actually count each one of those. And the reason why we do that is because if we really want to measure, for example, how many institutions are doing things in the area of management or in the area of science, we actually need to count each one of them. It doesn't change the big analysis significantly, and it really helps us to do this count just to be able just to drill down and to get more insights on how universities are actually elaborating and working on articulation agreements in across different perspectives of the strategy. Okay, so that's how we do the count. And in the latest analysis, we actually collect the data of 35 Australian universities, as I said. Now, those 35 Australian universities engage with more than 3,000 different institutions. So you can see articulation agreements and RPLs have been something very, very that a lot of universities or most of universities are actually taking this quite seriously, as you know. So there is an engagement with more than 3,000 institutions that is leading us to nearly 20,000 agreements that we can count. It's about 18,313. So quite substantial the amount of activities and initiatives that exist in this particular area. And what is interesting is just to see how, in general, we're actually moving when we do this particular count. And the first one that I think is quite interesting and a good reminder is when we actually look at the location of those partners. And it's a good reminder because the location of these partners, the number one location is Australia, and the rest of the partners are outside of Australia. So about 40% of the partners that universities have with articulation and RPL agreements are in Australia. For everybody who is in this space, this is nothing new, but for everybody that is just engaging and trying to get an understanding of this is a very important thing. And it shows how rich is the ecosystem that we have in Australia that allow international students just to be more mobile and have more different options while they are on shore. Now, the other a large group of agreements are actually outside of Australia. As you said, it's about 62%. So about probably two-thirds of the lot are actually in countries outside of Australia. So this is just once again just a very initial important reminder of how we have those two ecosystems, because often it's seen that articulation is just to have an agreement with somebody outside of Australia. Well, the reality is that we also have a large component of those agreements on shore. Now, when we look at the agreements done outside of Australia, these are at the top location of the partners that universities are engaging. And there are not a lot of surprises in here, but it's important just to look at the results. The number one with nearly 2,500 agreements is Singapore. Australian universities, as you know, they have a great tradition in this area with Singaporean institutions. The next one is China with nearly 2,000, followed with Malaysia, which we also know they has a great tradition in this particular area. Number four, it's an interesting one, which is Canada, and I will talk about Canada in a second. But before I really get into the rest of them and talking about Canada, it shows that for some universities, not all of them, articulation agreements are not only an opportunity to engage with more international applicants, but it's an opportunity to diversify your student cohort, and a very effective way to do it if it's done properly. And that's the topic of Canada that I will share with you in a minute. But following Canada, we have India, Hong Kong, Vietnam, the US, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia, which, with the except of the US, I think in terms of student recruitment, there are more traditional markets. Now, something that is quite interesting is these ones, India and Vietnam. And this is because we look at the results of the same analysis that we conduct in 2019. And although I will be careful about comparing this data set year by year, because as I said, the completeness of the data changes, the number of institutions changes, it's quite interesting to see the growth that exists in this area for these particular countries. So back in 2019, we had about 250 agreements reported for India. Now it's 701. So very, very important growth. And Vietnam, only 72 in 2019, and now more than 500, which is showing that it has been a growth interest in these two particular areas or particular countries. Now, the other one that I think is interesting to consider that is not on the top 10 of location of institutional partners, and I just want to highlight that one, is the Philippines. The Philippines, back in 2019, we only identified 20 agreements, and now in 2024 is 5 times more with 110 agreements. So it's one of those countries where definitely there is a lot more interest and a lot more activity, and definitely something worth to look at. Now, what I love out of this data set is the different angles that you can actually take to understand the activity in this particular area. And that really helps just to complement and to get perspective in your strategies. Because although it's also very interesting to look at the number of agreements, it's also interesting to look basically from the other side, how many Australian universities are creating articulation and RPL agreements in these countries in particular. And let me just show you the results of that. So from the 35 universities that we collect the data, 26 of them are already engaging with Singaporean institutions, 31, pretty much everybody with Chinese institutions, followed by Malaysia, then Canada with 11, India 27, Hong Kong, Vietnam, and so on. So this gives you that additional perspective just to understand how many universities have a history in that particular country. And that really helps us just to understand two things. First of all, if you are engaging for the first time in that particular country, with the data, you can actually look at what others have done and basically pretty much accelerate the process, but also show you where are some opportunities. For example, with Canada, there are only 11 universities doing articulation agreements with Canadian institutions. And in fact, I know that there is quite a few of these 11 who are having a very successful and on bringing together these articulation agreements and create diversity in their campus through a very successful and strong articulation agreements. So it really helps you just to realize where there are opportunities and where you can actually bring diversity to your campus. Other countries that are not in the top 10, but that are interesting to look at is a few Latin American countries where there are just very, very few universities engaging in articulation with universities in that region. And as a result of creating that pathway, you're actually creating a different way in which you can actually engage with students from those particular regions, which we know that sometimes either because it's highly competitive or because it's simply too far and too costly to engage in direct recruitment, you need to look for an alternative. And this is when this could be the alternative. The case of Canada for me is one of those very interesting case studies that I think is interesting to look at from how articulation can bring diversity in your campus in a market that is not the traditional market for Australia. Okay? And finally, also the Philippines that I mentioned before, only 12 universities from Australia are engaging with Filipino institutions, which is interesting to look at. And once again, that's something that the data really helped us just to understand and find a more strategic approach in your articulation strategies. Now, the other thing that has been quite interesting, and this is since 2019, and once again, for everybody who has been in this space for a long time, this is not news, but it's worth just to take a minute just to put some consideration on it. So as a result of looking at the 18,000 articulation and RPL agreements and then classify them by study level, it's quite interesting just to see that only about 8% of them are actually for postgraduate studies. We know that traditional articulation has been an undergraduate space, but when we think or we see that half of international commencements in Australia are for postgrad, I think it really raised the question on if there is an opportunity to have an articulation agreement in this space. Now, I know it's very different to do it for an undergrad and for postgrad studies, but it's something that I think is worth consider and see if there are any opportunities in this particular space. In particular, because when we look at this distribution of postgrad and under for by these markets, as you can see, the green is all the articulation agreements that exist for undergrad. And then I'm just going to start highlighting in orange the ones for postgrad. So Singapore is just this, like you can barely see it. So you just click and just barely see it. China is actually a little bit more in the postgraduate space. So it shows that there are opportunities in that market that already are taking off. Malaysia is also cleaning the undergrad side of thing. Canada, just like China, also shows a more stronger component from postgrad. India, that traditionally is a postgraduate market, it shows also a few postgraduate articulation and RPL agreements, and so on. So I think you get the idea that once again, this is when the data is really helping us just to understand and probably assess if there are opportunities in this area or not. Although I insist, I know that there are challenges in bringing articulation agreements for postgraduate studies, but maybe in certain markets there are opportunities there that universities are missing, and I'm hoping that this probably helps just to bring up some of the opportunities that may exist in this particular area. Now, finally, and this is another one that is interesting because when we look at the number of agreements by field of study, and this is again not a surprise, the very, very, very vast majority, 40%, are actually in management and commerce, basically in business, which once again raises probably the opportunity that in some other discipline areas, maybe, and this is again on the topic of diversity, maybe there is opportunities there. I was in particularly surprised when things like information technology, which is only 8%. I know that other areas like education, for example, could be probably a lot harder and held because of academic restrictions that we have in Australia. But definitely only 8% in information technology is something that it's interesting to consider. And also probably in areas like creative arts, only 7%. But definitely something that we consider that at the moment, clearly the big push of articulation in across the Australian universities that we collect the data, it's mainly in the areas of management and commerce, which once again brings the question of, are there any opportunities in other discipline areas that we might consider? Okay. So overall, we believe that the use of data in this area in particular will really help you just to support your articulation agreements. I know that there is great expertise in the sector in this particular area, but when we see the richness that exists in terms of how many universities are engaging with so many different institutions, I think there is an opportunity to learn from the data and to really, really support, I insist, those conversations that exist on how to identify the right partner, and especially taking the opportunity to look into what others have been doing just to find direction and be more strategic. If you want more information about the report, we can also provide that to each one of you. As I said, we can provide you a sample, we can provide you a demo, so you can see how much information is collected in this particular area. Oh, well, thank you so much for your time. I hope that it was interesting for you to know more about what we have been doing in this particular space. As I said, it's a space that definitely is getting interest, is getting traction, and what we are trying just to create awareness of how the data can actually help you just to support your articulation agreements. Once again, thanks so much for your time. We'll send you more information soon, and it's great to connect with you once again. Okay?